Our second speaker is Dr. Jessica Henry. She was the 2014 University Distinguished Teacher. She has been an associate professor. She's been a former chair of justice studies. Her research expands from wrongful convictions to hate crimes to death penalty perspectives. Her work has been widely translated into a variety of languages and was even adopted by the government of China as a policy piece when they were examining the death penalty and its applications in China. It is my distinguished pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Jessica Henry, who really needs no introduction, since most of you have probably been in one of her classes at one juncture or another.
Hi, everybody.
Okay.
So I'm going to be talking about imagining justice in the context of wrongful convictions. So in the context of people who are wrongly convicted of crimes that they simply didn't commit. And to start the conversation, if I can use this clicky, everyone who's had me knows I love a clicky, but this is not mine. Oh, just you press it. So the first thing I want to start by saying is, in the criminal justice system, before somebody can be convicted, the prosecutor has to prove the defendant is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. But beyond a reasonable doubt does not mean beyond all doubt. It doesn't mean to an absolute certainty. It doesn't mean to 100% accuracy. We allow for the possibility of error in the very standard by which we require the prosecution to prove its case. So the possibility of error is built in to the criminal justice system. We create that opportunity every time we bring someone before a jury or into a courtroom and require the prosecution to meet its burden of proof, which means we sometimes get it wrong. And when we do, people are sent to prison for crimes that they didn't commit, where they can languish not just for days, but for months and years, and sometimes decades. Most recently, just in the last month, someone was released from prison having been wrongly convicted for a crime where he served 45 years. So there's a couple things we need to sort of accept as truths. First is that innocent people are wrongly convicted of crimes they didn't commit. And we know for sure of 2,197 known exonerations. That was as of yesterday. Today, that number is actually 1,098. That's only the tip of the innocence iceberg. We actually don't know how many people are wrongly convicted. But we do know that about 2.3 million people are in the criminal justice system. Estimates range between 3 and 5% of those people are wrongly convicted. I'll let you do the math, but it's thousands of people potentially who have been convicted of crimes that they did not commit. The second thing that we need to accept as a truth is that even though it's beyond a reasonable doubt and not beyond all doubt, right, even though we kind of build into the system this possibility of error, when innocent people seek to challenge their conviction, the system does absolutely everything in its power to protect and preserve their conviction. And I'll give you a couple of examples so you know I'm not just saying that. The first I want to talk to you about is Wilton Dedge. He was convicted of rape in Florida, was sentenced to 22 years, and he was one of the first people who had heard about DNA and requested that his DNA be tested. So he made this request in 1996. Now, there was a bill that was pending in Florida that didn't get passed till 2001. But somehow his motion in 2000 got granted. And they tested that DNA, and it excluded him. He was not the rapist. But instead of cooperating, the prosecution said he filed his motion too soon, the new law doesn't apply to him, and we will not work with you to exonerate him. It took 3 years and many, many appeals before a court finally agreed to retest the evidence where he was excluded again. So not only did this man serve a total of 22 years for a crime he didn't commit, but he was held 3 years longer than he ever needed to be held because the prosecution fought him. Anthony Wright. He was exonerated in 2016 after having been sentenced to life in prison without parole for a terrible crime, a rape and murder of a 77-year-old woman in Philadelphia. And he had been coerced into confessing. I know many of you do not understand that, but false confessions are very, very common in the context of wrongful convictions. But he, too, had DNA that could be tested, and the prosecutor's office fought him for 8 years before they would release the evidence to allow for DNA testing. And as soon as it was released, it confirmed that someone else, a man named, Ronnie Bird, had committed the crime. So Ronnie Byrd had passed away in the interim. And instead of releasing Anthony Wright, our person who we're talking about here, the prosecution came up with a whole new theory, one they hadn't presented at trial originally, saying Anthony Wright worked with Ronnie Byrd to commit this murder. Ultimately, Anthony Wright was acquitted and he was released, but the prosecution wouldn't let it go. I'll give you a third case, and this is a movie you can watch called The Confessions. Has anyone seen it? It's about the Norfolk Four men who were coerced into confessing to a terrible rape murder. None of them committed it. There was DNA available before trial. They tested the DNA. They found the perpetrator. They matched the perpetrator. The perpetrator said, yeah, you know what? I confess. I did it, and I did it alone. But the prosecution said, no, you didn't, and changed the entire theory of the case and prosecuted each and every one of these men. And they all spent time in prison for almost 2 decades, even though the prosecutor knew that they had the right guy, which was none of these men. They were pardoned in March 2017. Now, some of you may be sitting there thinking, why? Why? Why would anybody do this? And it's not really clear, but I have some ideas, and this is taking us into sort of this talk about reimagining justice. Part of what happens is really good people go into the criminal justice system. If you want to be a prosecutor or you want to be a police officer, it's typically because you want to help the world, right? You want to help society. But there winds up being a culture in some offices or in some communities where winning becomes valued over justice. Regaining a conviction is the currency, not doing what's right. There's also a larger criminal justice issue where we have a commitment to finality over a fear of process. We're afraid that if we start entertaining these wrongful conviction cases, that we're going to open the floodgates. Some people call this the fear of too much justice. But that is a fear that we need to reckon with if we're ever going to really address the issue of wrongful convictions. We have election pressures. We have elected judges and elected prosecutors who are afraid to be seen as soft on crime, particularly in high-profile cases. And there's lots of psychological theories. Are there any psychology majors or minors in here? So I can't get into all of this. I'm so glad to see you all here. But there's this notion of cognitive dissonance, right? And part of that, and it's much more complicated than what I'm about to say, but is this notion of if you're so committed to a theory and you feel like you've done right, then how do you face the unfaceable, knowing that you actually did something wrong or that you got it wrong? And so when I think about how we could reimagine things, it's actually addressing that attitude. Can we imagine a system that would allow us to take these claims seriously? And part of it is attitudinal. So for the actors in the system, for the police and the prosecutors and the judges, they'd really have to embrace the reality that the system makes errors. We're all human. Humans make errors, and not take it so that it's a case of them being condemned for having made this error, but kind of owning it and working to correct the error. That's an attitudinal shift. The second is procedural changes. We need to work on addressing procedures that could prevent wrongful convictions in the context of interrogation or eyewitness testimony or the reliance on informants or cross-checking people with real motives to lie. And we need to work on procedures that would better respond to both post-conviction claims of innocence. And that's how I would start to reimagine a justice system that really effectively responded to wrongful convictions. Thank you.